All of that is correct. So I'm going to stop projecting. No teacher voice when there's an icon. Sorry. Except for the arm twisting part. I was very excited for the chance to do it. And I want to give you all a heads up that when I ask you to introduce yourself, I have a small initial assignment. I was thinking of asking you why you're here, but that might take longer than you want. And also, it's going to be a discussion the whole time. So what I'm going to ask is that you say your name and then give me one word that, for you, encapsulates how you feel about politics. So I'm saying this now so you can decide on a good word. I imagine it'll give us some breath. But yeah, so I'm Justin. Please just call me Justin. I work at Midshore Community Mediation Center right here in Easton. My career until a couple years ago was as an academic, taught political theory, human rights, introduction, peace studies, a variety of other sort of political science, humanities things. Happy to talk more about that. When Lynn and I were talking about this class, trying to figure out what to call it, which is always a difficult exercise, I think one of the shorthand labels that we cited was civics for grown-ups, which is problematic in part because it's not actually civics. I'm not going to just tell you how things work. I want it to be a discussion. So I think in some sense it might be becoming more of a hit-and-run political theory. Because I'm accustomed to teaching for 90 minutes twice a week for 15 weeks. And I'm a planner, so I've got probably 5 overlapping plans for how to shoehorn an interesting conversation in 90 minutes. You're all more familiar with this platform than I am. It's going to go well, and we're all going to come back together next Tuesday to talk about this a little bit differently. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I hope to do for the next hour and a half. I did send you all an email where I tried to make it very clear that I was not giving you homework, and I promise none of you will miss anything if you did not read it. I have created hard copies of what I distributed because I think there are some small passages that I really do think are going to be worth talking about in some minute detail. And I'm going to want to hear from all of you if you did take some time to read it or if you had some thoughts or some questions on it. So I have some goals where I'd like us to be in an hour and a half, but I'd also like you all to be at least closer to where you would like to be in an hour and a half if you're coming in looking for something and thinking about something. So I want to hear from you. I want this to be an open discussion. I don't have a set curriculum of things I need to say about the things that we read. I want to make this as much of a back and forth as possible. In terms of politics, I'm not the sort of political scientist who is going to come in and say that we all have opinions and I need you to put those in a little box. But we're going to talk about facts, and I need you to put these over here. I hope that you brought a bunch of feelings and opinions and experiences and sensibilities, because that is the substance of what I want to talk about. I think very much that it is important to care about politics because we don't really have a choice. And when we are trying to not pay attention to politics, politics is happening to us. When we come back next week, we'll talk more about this from a sort of bottom-up direction. But today we're going to talk about structures and laws and sort of how the rules that govern us now came into being. I picked a couple of nodes that I think will be helpful to get us there. So in terms of us interacting with each other, it's a self-selecting group, so I feel pretty comfortable assuming you're all here because you want to hear and you want to engage. So I'm not worried about it. My one request to you is that you remember that if we're talking about something controversial, it by definition means that people disagree about it, and that we need to take evil and stupid off the table as explanations for why we disagree. They're still going to be in the back of our mind. We all know that. You need to take evil and stupid off the table, and if you make a simplistic, deductive statement about something you know to be controversial, you're silencing someone else who probably has a really good reason for disagreeing with you. And you're denying yourself the chance to engage with them, and if nothing else, hear from them about why they disagree. So my one ground rule request is to recognize that to talk about politics is doing politics. We're experiencing difference. We're engaging with people. We're talking about how we interpret the same words differently. we feel very strongly about things, we want things out of it. And we're all sharing this space, literally as citizens of this room and also of this country. So we'll talk more about all that. Anyway, I hope I've filibustered enough to hear from you. You've chosen your word. I will allow the gentleman flanking me to decide who's going to go first. But so I'd like to hear your name and give me your one word of how you feel about politics. Sounds like you're volunteering, Bill.
Okay, Bill. Complicated. See interactions.
Thank you.
Deeply concerned.
That's 2 words.
Words.
Adverbs are okay, they don't count. So,
Put the adverbs.
Carolyn, confused. Canada, mess.
indefinite articles also don't have something. Bill?
Let's
Unmute
yourself.
Speak for
We can't hear you yet, Bill. Compared to a computer, you might be able to just hit the space bar.
That's a polysyllabic word.
No, that didn't work.
You did a lot of words.
So Claudia, why don't you step in real quick while
Yeah, I'm Claudia. Mysterious.
Thank you.
And Joyce, we can't see you, but we presume you can hear us and can turn your mic off. No, Bill's one listener. Bill, you're
Really,
good.
the lower left side of your screen, there should be a video and your audio if you go there with your cursor.
Okay.
You may not, oh, there you are.
Bill Sweeney and Broken.
Thank you.
I'll be partisan. Bob, I'm Bob, Libertarian.
Okay. I'm Lynn. Chaos.
Harold, Love. Politics.
Mark, discouraged.
Mike, dysfunctional.
Jackie, uncivil.
Jack Sherman, very disappointed.
Oh, we all came up with different terms. Amazing.
And many, many very good words, I should say. So,
Like no one said what she said or what they said.
yes.
Hi. Oh, good. Now you get to introduce yourself.
I was going to extend our reprieve.
Supposed to do your name and one word to describe your feeling about politics. English was added, disgusted. See, another word.
So we have complicated interactions, deeply concerned, confused, a mess, broken, mysterious, libertarian, chaos, love, an outlier. So thank you, love. Discouraged, and then I got lost here. Uncivil, disgusted, disappointed, disturbing. Mike, is that yours? Functional, dysfunctional. This is excellent handwriting in front of me.
Difficult to figure or doctor. 1
Twice as long as full and tiny fraction of the income, not at all there. Okay, so what I think I'll do is say as little as possible about why I picked the things that I picked to say about what work I think they're doing, and then I have a bunch of questions about them. I would love to be interrupted at any moment with any questions. I mean, assuming they're germane. And we can go from there. When we have a couple minutes left before we go home. take off, I'd like to check in with all of you about next week, and then sort of I can prepare next week to be as aligned as possible with what's going to be useful and interesting to all of you, and we'll go. So I wanted to start with the Mayflower Compact. I know I just said I was going to talk about that question. So it's really short. So there's that. I'm assuming that everyone has heard of this. How many of you had read that, or like have a vague memory of having been asked to read it at some point in history? So a couple of us, I was never assigned it. I was shocked at how short it was when I started teaching, and I said, we should make sure they read this. I thought I screwed myself, actually. I had a whole day on the syllabus for it. Should check that out first. It's not long enough. Turns out it is long enough, though, because there are a couple really important things going on here. This is happening in a way that I think is raising really important questions about what it means to found something, what it means to be a founder, what it means to decide that a thing has been founded. One of the early questions that Lynn and I were juggling was why did I think one of the framings is why did the founders decide to make the United States a republic and not a democracy? Which that's why we're going to read the Federalist Papers, because that's the answer. But one of the things going on here is they're starting by saying, and it should be in front of all of you, I think, that for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another. So it's a long introductory phrase to say, we already have a purpose. We're already on a boat. We already made a bunch of decisions. We already have a reason for doing what we're doing. We are bringing all of this with us. There's a background. We're not starting from scratch. Like, we're not different people who decided to go camping and then found each other in the bush and decided, oh, let's get together and make a society, right? They are inheriting. I'm just going to, this is one of the things that you do when you have 90 minutes, right? I'm going to skip over some of the questions here. They're bringing a bunch of norms and expectations and values and judgments with them. One of the questions that I think is important to be asking ourselves when we read something like this is, what did they take for granted? What was normal at the time? What was new and what was continuous? What was the sort of thing that they didn't feel like they had to say? So, I mean, we could talk extensively about gender if we wanted to. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, gender and politics. To just point out the obvious. There's something common about all the signatories to this document, and it wasn't everyone on the boat, right? So one of the questions that's happening here is, when we say that we founded something, what do we really mean by that? Because in a simplistic sense, it seems like we started from scratch. We created something, and then we were done. And one of my arguments that I would float for all of you, and I certainly want to hear back from you, is that you have to have some sort of definitive moments when you say that's when this was founded, that's when this was established. Usually for the United States, we say 1776, which, interestingly enough, has nothing to do with the Constitution. It's the Declaration of Independence. It was in the middle of a war that we started fighting with no intention of declaring independence. We retroactively decided, oh, that's when we became us. So by founding, we're usually saying that there was some sort of shared sensibility in the past of that's when this was a thing that we started. And this document here is an example of that. I want to come back to that. The other thing, though, just to kind of give the outline that I want to talk about here, there's, at this point in 1620, well over 100 years of English and continental philosophical tradition of talking about what you may have heard talked about as social contract theory or social compact theory, of people starting. Thomas Hobbes during the English Civil War in the early 16th century is often credited with being one of the first people to really articulate it cogently, but basically by saying that we as individuals can agree amongst each other to form a whole of which we are then members and to which we are then subjected. John Locke is another person you might have heard of. And it's very much the logic that underpins a lot of the rest of what we're talking about here, and we'll come back to the Federalist Papers. But so even in 1620, you see this consolidation of a logic that was, hey, we're going to need to make just and equal laws, ordinance, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. Meaning, we're going to need to make decisions. And in order to make those legitimate decisions, we need to agree first that these are the rules of the game. So before I ask any questions, any thoughts or questions or pushback? Yes, sir.
I think with any document, you've got to try to unravel the presuppositions. In other words, what was the culture? What was the religion? What was the dynamics at that time before you can understand why they said what they did? But I think that's lacking today in our ability to understand each other often because we don't understand each other's presuppositions often before we make statements.
So
What
thanks.
do they presuppose? What do they presuppose?
And I think what I'm hearing, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, I think what I'm hearing is that, yeah, to do a fair job to ourselves, an intellectually honest job of reading it, we need to do that. But also as a citizenly tool, we owe each other the grace and patience to at least ask ours to think about what their normal is. I agree. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's an important part of this. Yes.
You know, you have a scale. Think about it. One
Can
side
you
of the
speak
scale.
up so that they'll be able to?
Beg your pardon. One side of the scale is weighted in politics, in political stuff, various parts of philosophy, etc. But the other side of the scale, the other scale, is religion. And depending on which way you see that scale, you have to look at which one is more, at any given moment in history, which one is more important, or which one is being documented most or discussed about the most. Pilgrims had an amazing amount of information in their trip to England, but also the years they spent in Holland and dealing with the Dutch. When they came back, when they finally wound up across the ocean into what became the Cape, they had to deal with the religious aspects or the spiritual aspects, perhaps more accurately, of the native people. They had to deal with that. But, you know, there's politics in all of it. Scale's got a lot of different pieces to it. Which one is heavier at any given time in the history of these people?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're highlighting a couple of important themes there, which is, A, when we say politics, what do we mean by politics? So we're going to spend all of this talking about that. So I'm trying not to let the cat fully out of the bag on that, right? But so that's a live question. What do we mean by politics? I mean, at this point, the Thomas Hobbes thing to which I'm referring, that comes out or follows on from another tradition, not that it's an outgrowth of it, but an earlier tradition of recognizing politics as itself the work that is not the work of the church. So that what we understand as politics is whatever's not the work of the church. So you have Thomas Aquinas and Thomists, and you have late Roman and early medieval thinkers talking about different ways of understanding this and understanding how do we order society on a much larger scale than this, but on a tiny scale compared to ours, right? And thinking about, well, we know what the church is. Religion is the known quantity. There's a bishop that's telling us what to do. There's clergy. This is our moral, ethical, communal fabric.
Politics, though. It's a political system.
Which which we would recognize, and I guess part of what I would suggest is that we, to your point, and I think to yours, Harold, right, thinking about what sounded and normal to them. The question of politics versus church or politics and church was a different relationship than what it had been before, and it's probably different from what it is for us.
Doesn't every group have to form some way of governing themselves so they get chaos? So there have been many sociological studies that have looked at groups that have been shoved aside. Prison, for example, any group really to function, somebody becomes a leader. And here they say the king is still their leader. They're bringing the social mores of England with them. I guess it's England, yeah, Great Britain, France, with
It was all,
with them.
I see it, Rob.
Yeah, I think with the word religion, I think we have two religions. They both have saints, they both have martyrs. And like a theological or political statement, we have a secular religion and we have a theistic religion. But they both function with the same categories in that they have saints and martyrs and people that they listen to, whether it's like the Pope or whatever. And I think that's one of the things we have to understand. There's two religions here. And I use the religion not thinking in terms of Christianity, but more the theistic side than the other. Until you look at what were those presuppositions there, I think it helps with the discussion.
But that's not true at that time, because religion and the politics were interspersed. The king was the leader of the church. And
I'm talking about
the other issue that it's not addressed here is the unstated assumption of what Christian is.
Yeah.
For these people, Christian was not, these weren't Puritans, they were
Their religion.
their particular approach to Christian, not what we think of as the general description, which would include Catholic, Protestant, etc. So those things are not addressed here.
Right, and which I think goes back to the sensibilities of it went without saying, right? So like they didn't write it for us at large, but I mean I think that we're highlighting really important questions. What is politics? What is religion? Like these things that seem self-evident words that would easily under the radar as, oh, I know what that is, and we would be wrong. These are those controversial points that we need to re-complicate. And I would also say that one of the things growing out of this is there's a tension here, and I think that you're all hitting at that tension. We've reintroduced that tension in some ways, people might say, as we've sort of argued over the last 250 plus years about really what the First Amendment means. And as a non-constitutional scholar, we can have that talk, but I'm not the expert to weigh in on that. But I think that one of the things going on here is, yes, they're taking it for granted that they are acting in the name of God, amen, and also referring to the King of England, who is the head of the Anglican, who is obviously deeply ingrained in what's happening with Reformation politics notwithstanding. So one of the things that's helpful for us to think about, because this is a historical text, but also it's 2025, and there's a reason I picked this one to talk about, is that it matters now as an example that can remind us to think about the extent to which, and I think as you phrased it, Harold, we could understand politics as a secular religion. I would suggest, and you're not alone in that framing, lots of people have made arguments that if by religion we mean that we derive, that our sense of legitimacy and right is derived from unverifiable ideals, things that we can't put our hands on, things that we can't prove, that in some logical sense, there isn't necessarily a stark difference between saints and angels and rights and laws. Now, there's obviously a gigantic difference between those things, but insofar as we're talking about traditions where in order to get through the world, in order to share the world with people that are different from us, we let some things go without saying, and we have to accept as true enough things that can't be proven like water freezing at 32 degrees or gasoline, burning in our car engine. We have to have faith-like investments in certain abstractions in order to make things work. So one of the things that we're seeing in this document is them starting to separate those out, right? Because if it is just it's all going without saying, if in fact that this is how that works, they don't need to make a compact to have legitimacy down the road. So I'm bringing this up as sort of a nexus as part of the tradition that, 150 something years later, people like James Madison are thinking, and obviously I'm not meaning to imply there's a direct lineage and that the Constitution is a direct descendant of it. But this is a really interesting node in some of that thought history about what goes without saying. And if you said it, you probably thought it needed to be said. So we know that it no longer went without saying. That this is an important way to not all kill ourselves when we get off this boat on that beach. Either because we hate each other or because we're going to be so vulnerable to the indigenous communities that we're pretty sure are there and we're feeling at risk for whatever reason. I sense that there's a needed comment over there and I'll talk over you. One of you? No? You're both just... Okay. I trust you to interrupt me, so. So one of my questions, Mayflower Compact. So it says, I guess it's the fourth to last full line of text. I'll read it. So, so before that, frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutional offices from time to time, it shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general need of the colony. And then here's the phrase: for the general need of the colony, or the virtue hereof to enact, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So there's a pronoun now, unto which. What is the which? Like, to what are these people agreeing to submit and obey?
Any future rules or regulations, if you will, today's
Equal laws, ordinance, act, constitution, and offices, which apparently can change from time to time, that you'll submit to those. That's what they're agreeing to.
Right. Yes, thank you. So grammatically, like that, the antecedent is, we're deciding now that this is the us that can legitimately make these decisions. And in order for the us to make legitimate decisions, we're agreeing now that in the future, after we've made those decisions, we will then submit and obey. Right? We are committing future us. We're committing far future us to follow the rules of immediate future us.
and future rules.
And future rules. Right. Right, as in shown from time to time. Yeah. So we'll make new ones and we'll adjust it. So this is another important sort of legal node here to the question of what does it mean to be legitimate? What does it mean? What is legitimacy when we talk about legitimate laws versus illegitimate laws or just laws or just, yes, sir?
Think trust. You get a bag of trust. You see that bank, and it always amazes me. What does that mean? Yeah, wonder. Well, we trust the people, and they trust us. And I think that trust was in a place where nobody was. Either it's evidence of some humanity with these people. They found this stuff, but they had to trust each other that what they were about to do was serious business. It was a life threat, and they actually lost a few where they got off the boat. I mean, they were really, I think, scared, if you pardon the expression, shitless. And I think that was something when they set this up, somebody came up with a memo and said, this is a memo to work. We're all going to agree this. We're all going to do this. Aren't we? God knows if we don't, what's going to happen. So I think that trust is the big gun.
So it's trust from a heightened position of vulnerability. It's not just flat trust. It's trust because we need to trust something.
Yeah, I think, yes, thank you.
Was there?
Yeah, you had really good comment.
This is for 56 and 84 body.
That's what we've all lost is trust,
Trust.
trusting each other, trusting our government.
So one of the things that's, I mean, in addition to being so short, that makes this useful as a document to talk about,
And 2 long sentences.
is that maybe they could use an editor. They were in a hurry.
They need 3 minutes.
Is if as far as we know, this has really actually happened, but also it's actually a really potent metaphor. It is people in a state of vulnerability, duress. They're on a boat. They're isolated. Right? If you need to come up with an example to talk about society, you usually come up with some way. All right, so imagine people stuck on a boat or stuck on an island or whatever.
They're replicating what they are familiar with.
Yes, and I would suggest that because I have no quarrel with the importance of thinking about trust being a useful mechanism to recognize that I'm willing to trust you if you trust me. That's in some sense what we're seeing here. So we're all going to agree to trust, and I'll do it if you'll do it, right? That
Trust both ways or just gonna trust those that are making.
you caught my trick question. I'll come back to that.
How far does that trust go? Are we also trusting, in this case, the government of England to think that we can manage on our own without their limits?
So what is the substance of the trust and who's giving and who's getting the trust? I think two important questions. The other thing I was going to say is, it's really easy for us in this, to go back to the sensibilities and what went without saying question, for us to use our notion of trust here. These people had a tremendous amount in common. They knew each other. They were bringing social mores and inherited ethics. They also had just spent time on the boat. It's an awful lot. It's awful different to have to figure out how to trust, 30 or 40 people with whom you have that much in common than it is to experience politics the way that most of us would define politics, which is a question of how we navigate strangers and people who have had different experiences and different understandings and different backgrounds and different ethical commitments and difference.
Tension.
Which goes and tensions driving, which goes back to an earlier question of what do we mean by politics? Sometimes when we say politics, people hear, right, so this is the whole exercise of all but one of us had negative connoting words, right? Politics is often used as the label that captures big party, election-oriented politics, legislation, debates over policy, and governance disputes. I would suggest, somewhat from a position of devil's advocacy, but I genuinely believe it, that's fine to call that politics, but we should separate politics in that sense from what we actually would call political. And that if what's political in the political realm and to be a political person is operating in the world and figuring out how to share a world with people that are not ourselves, then yelling and arguing about policy isn't political at all. The voting booth is the least political place in the world because most of us already know what we're doing. We're going in and we're voicing it. Real politics is talking to neighbors and figuring out how to navigate disputes and disagreement. And I think that, I would never, I do see, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to complicate. I would never just sort of promulgate that as the definition of politics, but I want to encourage everyone to think, when we say politics, don't subsume the idea of politics within big T, top of the newspaper, above the fold policy, and just say that's gross, I'm not participating. Because then when you go home, you go to church or you go to Boy Scouts or Kiwanis or you talk to your neighbors, you're actually still being political. You're still doing an awful lot of trusting. You're still doing an awful lot of learning. There's no pauses. So I don't know whose hand is up first. But.
I would guess that during the time that they were on boat to get to kick that political alliances in terms of common thinking about certain topics probably was developing while they were on the boat and maybe even before they got to the boat. So when they got off of the boat, while they had these compacts, I'm sure there were different perspectives on what was going to evolve.
That many.
How would our rules evolve? What would be important? What did we have to legislate? What did we have to decide? Was probably somewhat
The devil is in the details.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I would say, in some sense, the overall question, which they then out of me to talk about, like, what's the point of all this? It wasn't just survival. I mean, in some sense, to avoid religious persecution, it could be understood as just survival. But in some sense, it's always useful to realize, like, outside of maybe a few outliers, literally every human being is an idealist and a utopian. We're all often chasing different ideals and different utopias, right? But very few people start out just trying to survive. There is an end goal there. This is why, this is what we want, this is where the meaning comes from. And to your point, yeah, they may have talked about that, or it may have been so implicitly latent in all the other conversations that it was predisposed, certainly. Sorry.
But to me, three most important words in here are just and equal. Because this is a group of people who weren't treated justly and didn't feel equal. And to me, that was their purpose for being here. To me, I think those are the most important words in here. And I think that's what's most meaningful.
We're getting away from that original question you had.
They're all important, but yeah.
I can't remember.
Oh, the original present. One of the questions, I didn't found the question. There's never an original.
It's original sin, though.
I've heard people argue that. I've read about it. Is legitimacy. What does legitimacy mean? And that's not the only question to ask here, but it's an important question in the intellectual tradition because I want to make sure that we get onto the Federalists soon, and then we'll sort of talk about these. Yeah.
Well, I think what they have here is we're all utopian, but utopian without checks and balances starts on a destructive pattern. And it looks like this is their checks and balances on their utopia so that they can be accountable and not just fall apart.
And to your earlier point, if I remember what it was, you were talking about the difference between reading the headlines, seeing what they're doing in Washington, frowning and going up here, and what we do here at home, which is the purpose of a class coming up in November that you and I are working on together, that where how many of us have a hard time talking to a parent or a sibling or a child because they have different views on something, and we have to learn how to talk about those views and express ourselves instead of just ignoring them.
So along those lines, what I was going to say before, my undergraduate government politics studies, I always remember this phrase, politics, interactions amongst people. That's what my word interaction started that. It is having two people are political.
But isn't it funny when I go to Rotary, you were talking about clubs, and how few of us belong to clubs anymore, but when I go to Rotary in the morning, I always come back with a smile on my face. It felt good. We didn't talk about politics. We were talking about what are we doing and how are we doing it. We learned something new if somebody came to speak to us. So those are important, immutable truths about community and why community is so important versus all that up there.
Thank you. I mean, and I would argue that anytime we as human beings, as individuals, have an opportunity to be confused by or in the presence of another human being, it's politics. There's a French philosopher, there's so many rabbit holes I needed to avoid in 90 minutes, so this is one of them. But there's a 20th century French philosopher whom I'll paraphrase, but saying that the really important disagreement isn't between one who says black and one who says white. It's between two people who say black and mean different things by it.
That's good.
So I'm sorry, persuaded by that, but politics is about being around other people because we're all different and recognizing the difference and the sameness, not fetishizing either of those, not focusing too much on, oh, we're all the same at the heart, we're all so deeply divided, but having that openness to improve ourselves. And, there's a 19th century philosophical tradition, many of you have read. So that John Stuart Mill very famously said, one of the reasons we need free speech and why we need to foster interaction is if you're right and you disagree, you're better off defending yourself. And you might help someone else to be right. Or you're wrong and you're better off because you've been corrected. And he was talking, we'll talk about this more in the class. It's like being right and keeping to yourself is not political and it's not helpful. Because one of the takeaways from there. One of the overarching questions that I want us all to have as we go forward from the Mayflower Compact, though, is if we talk about this, the now us committing far future us to what the near future us will decide, and that is what makes this a legitimate system, because we trust each other and will maintain the trust. And I want to come back to your very helpful question about what do we mean by trust, is doing the trusting. If that's the legitimacy, even if we say, okay, that's good logic, what happens when someone else needs to join the club? Because they didn't commit. Is it legitimate anymore? I'm asking sort of those kind of irritated freshman level philosophy questions, right? But none of us was alive to read this Federalist paper in the newspaper. Most of us think that in key ways, the United States government has, to some extent, legitimacy in legislating laws that govern our society. None of us had anything to do with agreeing. I'm making some judgments here, but none of us had anything to do with agreeing that those are the laws of this land to which we will be subservient and obedient. And I don't think that means it's not legit, but it's an important thing to remember that when we're thinking about navigating these positions of vulnerability, think about politics as how are we going to survive? Thinking about politics as how do we get what's good? How do we have that equality and that justice? And how do we have that fulfilling societal structure where we can engage with each other and we can extend grace to our neighbors because we're not worried about, retribution or whatever. All of those things are made possible in a system that exists on the basis of its own legitimacy, and it's a legitimacy that we can't attribute to anything specific, which I think goes back to politics is kind of a religion, because if we stop believing what's legitimate, then we're relying on laws, and one of the things that I think is pretty uncontroversial now is that laws without norms are largely effectual. So I want to use that as a segue to talk about, to jump over the Federalist thing, which we also, it's much longer, obviously. But what I wanted us to note about the Federalist Papers, first of all, this was written for a public newspaper, which is shocking. I am still mourning the fact the New York Times will no longer give me a hard copy at my doorstep. It's been a real problem in my life. Yeah.
Their votes.
It's shocking. Post does. No, not to your doorstep. What's that?
Not to your doorstep.
Yeah.
No.
As
I
I
no longer get it on my.
It must be in different
a couple
neighborhoods.
weeks ago, I was.
Well,
East and Village.
now it's not.
Yeah, that's when they canceled mine.
Wow.
But so with that,
No, I didn't cancel my subscription because I was, not reading it enough, and I was going between Ocean City and here, and it's the glass copy. Wow.
So the synopsis I would offer, and there's a lot in here, we could talk extensively about the Federalist Papers, And this is only one of them. This was a series of, I did some show and tell. I had to get out some new packing tape. This is a series of op-eds that were collected. They were not written as a book. They were not written by any one person. They were written by John J. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. There are 54 of them. I just forget. 84. Some of them are more important than others.
How many authors? So just
Three. And John Jay didn't write too many because he left to
Hamilton and
Madison. Yeah.
So was the purpose of writing those to explain the Constitution?
So they, in some, the shorthand is they were selling the Constitution for public support inside the states. New York was a pivotal state that needed to be on board to approve the new Constitution.
Was there a draft of the Constitution they were relating to, or these principles that they believe in the Constitution?
They were selling a draft, is my understanding. That is a history with which I'm not as familiar, but it had been developed and delivered.
I was going to say, when was it up for ratification in New York? Because this is 1787.
Right.
November 3rd.
Right.
They just, I think so. New York even said the Federalist Papers didn't make it in the Constitution. That's the only reason I mentioned that.
Right. Well, they were in the room, so there's a back and forth, right? The same people who were involved. And Madison was very much doing both, right? The thing that I think is important specifically about number 10 is that they are answering the question of this is the whole game. This is why this is the draft that we like. So in some sense, it answers a straightforward seeming question of why did you write the rules this way? And they're going through, in a very abstract, I think, not abstract, generalized but concrete way, saying, in a sense, we need to centralize authority. Because if we have diffuse authority is close enough to the public that in an unequal society, which is inevitable, bad actors can buy politicians because if we have too many politicians, they'll be cheaper. So if you have fewer, if you have a big country and everyone is governed by their county sheriff, individual county sheriffs are going to be easier to pay off and manipulate, and individual bad actors are going to be more able to become county sheriff than would be the case where entire states are governed by governors who are going to have to compete and who are going to be more transparent and visible and who will be responsible to more people and will need to balance different interests across their states, which is itself more corruptible than a strong central government. So there are a couple of key arguments that I want to talk about that I think are, if nothing else, really interesting anecdotes of, oh, that's why, But then I want to go back and talk about what went without saying. What were they doing? Why were they doing this? If you had, in the late 18th century, to figure out what to do with, remember, when they buy big country, they're talking Appalachians to the coast, right? Also smaller country, but it was big by historical standards. And these were people who had immigrated even then from different places and were coming with different expectations and different ideals. And you already had Catholics, you had Jewish communities, you had Muslim communities, you had Quakers, you had Shakers, right? So you already had the makings of the, I forget which one of those is the outgrowth of the other. They both make furniture, I think.
They brought them chairs.
So what Madison is saying here is it's going to be a free country. That's the ideal. We're not changing that point. And if we have freedom, there's going to be inequality. We can talk about that, but there's going to be economic equality that comes out of political equality, meaning freedom and liberty, will beget economic inequality. Some people will amass more wealth. Yes, sir.
But in all those statements you're making, they are making some assumptions about human nature.
Oh, a lot. Yes.
A lot.
Yes. Yes, they are, and I definitely want to come back. So one of the things that's going on here is that's their prescription, saying like, this is our diagnosis of how big countries work. Economic inequality will mean that some people will be self-interested. In some sense, this is just freshman level economics. Everyone's a rational actor. We need to challenge all those assumptions. But they're saying people can't be trusted to be a judge in their own affairs, which is. Okay. Yeah, so page 3. So there's going to be inequality. People will be self-interested. The more you can dilute that, the more difference and disagreement and variance of interest that you can lump together into the same polity under the ideal number of governing authorities, the more those things can balance themselves out. And disagreement's healthy. It comes with it. We don't want to silence the disagreement. We don't want to get rid of the cause, which calls faction. Liberty is going to happen. Inequality is going to happen. What we need to do is let it balance itself out. Yes.
But didn't they build in some level of dissent? Yeah, Hamilton wrote later on in Federalist 84 about free speech and ultimately what became the First Amendment. Well, so we looked at that dissent as a way to control the overreach of big government. But
Yes.
it came from that with King George, right?
Right, and it's important to remember that in 84 essays like this, they weren't fully in lockstep, right? This was kind of the discourses of interpretation, but also advancement. But they're saying, right in the first paragraph, he will not fail, therefore, this is the abstract, set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provide a proper cure for it. So it'd be easy to get rid of this problem if we silenced speech, got rid of inequality, and denied people economic and political liberty. And then right after this, I think goes back to something you were saying earlier, Lynn, the instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils, which is to say, when we were letting county sheriffs run us. Chaos begets injustice in this logic. So I don't know, it could take longer to connect those dots, right? But chaos is what lets the uncertainty come in. It's what lets the corruption come in. And it also is a functional denial of the property rights. So if it's chaotic and you're not sure that your crops are going to still be here in 2 months because people keep going across your land or there happen to be fires, you're not going to invest in growth. You're not going to have the substantive economic liberty. You have the economic liberty to basically go broke and probably die poor. And life is nasty, brutish, and short. That's the famous Thomas Hobbes construction of it, which goes back to the social compact thing we were talking about in the Mayflower Compact of, look, this is going to get really bad if we don't all agree to follow the same rules. And some of those rules are not going to be exactly what we want, but sometimes some rules are better than no rules at all. Would be the best gloss on this. And that's what's going on here. This is an essay saying we have ideals here, and I think here's an institutional arrangement that is pragmatic and practical for preserving as many of those ideals as possible, while ensuring that we'll still have a country in another 10 years in which we can protect things. So he's kind of saying, if we're just too idealistic and saying liberty, 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 which is, they probably use different words. That was their characterization of the Jeffersonians, right? Like, this is an agrarian country. We are all free. Local, 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 local. They're saying if we do that, actual humans are gonna screw it up. And some of them will get wealthy enough to deny those actual ideals to other people. And by pursuing this freedom thing too much, on the ground, we'll end up losing it in the long run. Which I guess is another way of saying freedom's really important. That is why we're here. We all need to agree that we're going to make some rules in the near term, and then in the long term, we're going to need to be ready to follow those. So this is a very drawn out revisitation of that, very similar logic that's in the Mayflower Compact that's going on for all this, of saying people are not trustworthy. And if we write the rules well enough, we can still have freedom and sort of balance out the lack of trustworthiness. It is assuming that people are going to get wealthy, and only some of them are going to get wealthy, and that the wealthy people will use that wealth to their own advantage. This is, depending on which part of Karl Marx's career we're talking about, 30 to 70 years in advance, but there's a logic in there that would not be unfamiliar to either of them to the other, of saying that if you have private property rights and everyone's on their own, you have political freedom to take care of yourself. Some of us are going to, through happenstance or aptitude or skill, accumulate more wealth. That's just an observed fact.
Just reading through all this, listening to both of the sides, they were all wealthy white men. So there's no way that there was freedom or liberty or fairness for everybody. No matter which side you look at, they came from really a very similar mindset and background and tried to create something that would be fair for everyone, and that everyone had freedom, and that everyone had liberty. And there was no way.
Well, yes, and I no quarrel
I mean, so it
whatsoever.
was kind of like doomed from the start.
Well, so there's an argument. There's an argument to which I'm cautiously sympathetic, which is that in some sense their specific intentions and preferences and ideals were less material than were their structural commitments. And that they created a system that had within itself the halting and inelegant and inartful mechanisms by which to change in a way that became more just, more equitable, more inclusive.
I agree with that. It would be very curious if we could go back in time and add women to the mix, add people of color to the mix, and really have, a diverse group of people create our republic. Where would we be today?
That's a
Which, we
let's
can't
put
have
that on the schedule for next year. But I think that this is a useful segue actually, because there's something else going on. And so it's a policy prescription. I'm doing it adequate justice by basically saying that super local control, because even if most people are fine and kind of can't trust people, super local control is going to be more unstable than more centralized control. And so therefore this is how we're running these rules.
Madison's contribution also was that we can't trust them all. We can't trust a lot of individuals to make decisions because they still get in a room and make each other excited, come up with ideas that may or may not be intended in reality. So we're going to put something in between individuals' points of view and actually how we legislate and create things, right? So that we're learned, we're thoughtful human beings will take all this information, come up with just and fair rules. And if you let you get some really weird stuff.
I don't disagree. I think that to use the word mob, and I think we should talk about that. Because I think he's saying something that interesting that's worth remembering. Which is that I'm trying to decide the best way to approach this. He's clearly saying something about what they would probably call human nature, or human predisposition, human fallibility, something. He's also talking about society in a not in a binaristic us and them sort of way. It can read that way because he is saying we are the ones trying to come up with the system. But what he's actually saying, I think, here's what I learned, that he's saying that because of human nature and because of what's going to happen as we have more liberty, is that you're going to have a hierarchical society, not elites, but a variety of different sort of power imbalances and vested interests. And this is what he's talking about with factions. I mean, in some really crude sense, he's talking about economic warlords and local gangsters. So it's worth asking ourselves, because I don't disagree with you. If instead of mob, what he's saying is that individual smallholder farmers, let's assume that those are the most easily romanticized voters, even in 2025, right? Family farms. I'm sorry. I don't mean to dismiss it. I'm just saying, he still has potency, right? But he's not saying that you can't trust smallholders, individual man on the street. He's saying if we don't have a structure I'm going to come back to that. If we don't have a big enough structure with rules that put transparency and that cast light on these things, someone else will come and create the hierarchy. So he's making two claims about this human nature thing. That people will be self-interested and they'll accumulate wealth and they'll advocate for themselves, but also that they're going to be inclined to accumulate political power and dominate other people. So it's not just us and mob. It's someone else is going to try and take over and do bad things, and it's going to be functionally the on the street equivalent of letting a sheriff run the county. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but I think that his argument isn't so much you can't trust the mob as that hierarchies are going to emerge one way or another. And if we're not careful about it, we're not going to get to be able to say how those hierarchies work. We think if we write this hierarchy, it'll be sustainable and viable and more or less transparent. And if we don't, I don't know what's going to happen. Yes.
That's what he's arguing for, republicanism versus democracy. That you're going to have hierarchy at national level and then a local level. You're going to have both. So.
Thank you. Yes.
Democratic. I think he's trying to put checks and balances on corporate evil, understanding a groupthink. The larger the group, the more vulnerable you can be to corporate evil taking over, and trying to put checks and balances on that, on both systems that way by having the smaller ones with accountability and then the larger ones with accountability to protect that dynamic of groupthink falling into corporate evil.
I agree. I mean, in thinking of it, corporate as any collection.
Collection.
I mean, there's a way in which we can understand this as a pretty fully fleshed out agreement with the social contract idea. And I might have not done this intentionally, right? But like, there's a way in which the Mayflower Compact can be understood as if we don't come up with a plan, things are going to get chaotic. And then Madison is in effect saying, if we don't come up with a plan, things are going to get chaotic. Here's all the ways in which they're going to get chaotic and how other plans would backfire, but how this plan will actually do that. And it'll preserve that legitimacy that, the snake eating its own tail, the circle that it both has to start in order to be legitimate, but by definition can't start because it's always referring to something else before it.
He's looking at me.
It looks like he totally lost conversation. The one word I'm noticing is missing in conversation, which is fascinating, is the word
Can you say more?
power.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I don't
Yes.
see the word. I don't hear it. I'm hearing everybody else talk about their power. And it's interesting. Why hasn't that word been used in this conversation? I mean, power is, well, it's currently very political. Subject political, unfortunately. But I don't know.
You mean?
I have an answer to that, but I'd like to hear more. Like, where would you put it? And I'd like to hear from, Bob.
Well,
What about?
some, well, if you Somebody else.
Well, the question is, where does the power reside?
Well, we need to be careful to make sure we know what we're saying.
Yeah.
What power? What do we mean by power?
Let me put a little perspective, I think. So it seems our founders anticipated a lot, in terms of limiting government and that sort of thing. But did they foresee that we ultimately would become exactly what Schwarzenegger was in terms of government? The government has become the same monster that the monarchy was when we separated from Great Britain.
I think that they didn't want to use the word power because they interpreted it as a king's power.
Negative.
They just didn't like that word.
Power is historically volatile as words go, right? So I agree. If the word power were in this, we would have to have a conversation about how it didn't mean what we thought it meant, probably.
But the neat thing about when you think of it as power, the way the Constitution was written is that we as individuals have power because we vote. The state has power because it basically votes, right? And then
Our local jurisdictions.
so yeah, everyone has a different layer of power, but then I couldn't help it. Earlier we were talking about why would we invest certain power in certain people, like political people who become so powerful and so rich as a result of how our government works with people who hand money for votes, basically. But when we do that, but in the process of doing that, they know so much, they have a different perspective than we do as voters here in Polk County. You know, they know why they're suggesting we do X, Y, Z. I didn't understand that. It'd be very frustrating when you know why something is being done, and you think nobody else understands that, but they're still going to be voting on the way it was written or something. So, digress.
Thank you. I mean, I think that when we're asking the question of what's going on at a time in history or in a text in a person's brain about what we could call loosely power, it's worth asking ourselves where we ourselves are drawing the lines between power, authority, right, and effectiveness. Because power can mean any one of those. And I think, there are illegitimate powers, there are legitimate powers, there are illegitimate authorities. We have rights delegated to us give us the powers to do some things, but also sometimes rights protect us against what other people would otherwise have the power to do to us. So power gets messy. And I think one of the things I'm hearing with you from your question is the strength part of it. Who has the ability to affect someone else's life, to impinge upon someone else's life, to make someone else do something they wouldn't otherwise do. The sort of classic understanding of person A has power over person B. Is that right? Or like when you say power,
I think that Madison's intent, excuse me, Madison intent, he's willing to talk about that issue. But what I see in his conversation is plea is he wants to be polite with it. He wants to say, look, you guys need to do this. This is a good thing. But underneath it, behind it, there's going to be a problem if you misbehave. There's going to be trouble. And we don't want that. We want everybody to do what they are hopefully able to do in their new world. They're saying we can do things. But little later on in the history, these are the guys that are on horses leaving Washington that beat up on some serious, say which one. Oh, anyway. couple of these famous people, I think Washington too, mounted a horse. They're going out to the public. These guys who were building whiskey operations, something like that, and saying, no. There's a tax. You're not gonna get this business going without putting the money on, in the palm of our hands. This is something you've got to do. Prior to that, there's this, pleasant, intellectual, answering other questions, and hopefully people will buy into it and understand why they want to have a constitution of this size.
I would argue that he is creating something that in essence is a power grab. He's creating this construct in which there is this representative democracy or republic that essentially all the people in these leadership positions are people who can vote, and people who could vote were landed white men. So it effectively excludes much of the population. I mean, it really doesn't even apply to most of the people who were probably living and working here at the time, less than 50%. So it's kind of artificial to my mind, because it really doesn't address the nation as a whole, or what existed then as a whole, and all the people that were living there. The average slave certainly had no rights, and the average working man had no rights. And it to me has created something that sounds very nice and very lofty and utopian, but really creates a system whereby they can continue on with the same sort of lifestyle that they had anyway.
So I wanted to follow, I see your hand, I just wanted to follow. I think what I'm hearing, so correct me if I'm wrong, is sensing what, by power grab, and you started with referencing power grab, wanting sort of understanding this as a conservative text of preserving crucial tenets of those inherited social mores that I was referencing earlier. And preserving the status and stature of the people in the position. In a sense, basically saying there's power out there, we should have it. And this is how we're saying. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes.
And I would offer up, mostly yes, I'm on board with that. But also I think that there's an argument that goes back to the question of what do we mean by mob? What's the downside of the alternative? Where he's saying, at the bottom of page 52, which is the bottom of 2 here, the regulation of these various interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. Is him saying government exists to balance these things. And in the very first part, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, which is to say, among the things that are good about the Constitution I just wrote, saying none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction, which goes back to avoiding the instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public council. So I think that the argument here, in some sense, is, or could be understood to be, yes, this is a conservative text. Yes, this is going back to a centuries-long tradition of social contract theory and intellectual influence in decisions about societal order, and saying power is going to be out there. We can't just decide that this is a country where if everyone just has their farm and their mule, everything's going to be okay, because someone will accumulate power. And it's better if we put that power centrally, conveniently enough with us, but it's better. Because I think that these are separable arguments. It's better to make a pragmatic argument. We did this for ideals. Here's an institution that preserves those ideals.
Then why would they make it a republic where they're basically decentralizing their power?
So, on page 54, the bottom of the first, the paragraph, the first full paragraph starts from this view of the subject. So that ends with theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government, which is to say the local, where every county is run by a sheriff, every town by a person, America, have erroneously supposed by that reducing mankind to perfect equality in their political rights, They would at the same time be perfectly equalized, assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. This is the human nature claim. It's a big part of it. But it's also by saying, all of that's fine. I don't quibble with that on its own, but it's not enough. He's saying that the counter argument is that if you just do this, everyone will go home and stick to themselves. And it's 2 paragraphs later. The 2 great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government. I want to come back to the word delegation. In the latter, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. The delegation is this conservative elitism, effete abstraction of we need to elect aristocrats. Delegation is this term of art as opposed to other forms of representation where we elect our neighbors. It's we're delegating our power to someone else who's going to make the decision for us. And then the scale thing.
They didn't have the lessons of the Articles of Confederation as well.
And that's the coherent scale thing, is that if you look, and then also, this first full paragraph that starts in the next place on page 55, that's where I'm going next, but apparently, yes.
I don't think power in itself is a bad thing. Last week I was in Williamsburg all week where this was coming. Nobody was there part, so a lot of times to ask questions, but power, knowledge is power, I put it that way. If you get power without knowledge, it gets chaotic. One of the things that I was interested in Williamsburg is the Bray School. It was started as a school. Miss Bray started as a school to educate the blacks so they could read. So they were educated there for about 30, 35 years. That helped the next generation to develop their children. They taught their children when they said, okay, they can't read or write, we don't want the slaves to study them. But already the knowledge had been put into a system where these people, the slaves, then teach their own slaves. So the Virginia slaves, by the time, in the late 1800s, most all of them before the Civil War were highly, literate and able to read. So that knowledge is power. If you have a power system where you don't allow people knowledge, then you have control things.
I think that
That's why it's important to educate our kids
right.
in our government structure.
Right.
Yeah, people on the government.
Yeah,
But it's the education and awareness that give credibility and track to the right to participate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess maybe back to the caution that I would forever urge us, right? When we think about power, yes, some forms of things that we think are good, we could call power. My power to vote, my power to have my own opinion, my power to go or to not to go to whichever church or synagogue I want to or don't want to attend. All those things. At the same time, the word power is often used as we put so-and-so in power and we need something. Sometimes we're worried if they're planning to leave that office. Right. No, and that's my point, is that we should be very careful when we think about power to sometimes think about, is there a better word? Do we mean authority? Do we mean to make a decision that affects other people? Do we mean ability to do something? Do we mean leeway? There's a really interesting, I see what you're saying. There's a really interesting, and maybe we'll talk about it next week, conversation to be had about what some people would call the difference between negative liberty and positive liberty, which is 20th century terminology. But when we talk about liberty, sometimes we mean I have the liberty to do something. And when we talk about liberty other times, sometimes we mean I have liberty to not be forced to do something by someone else. So sometimes my liberty negates other people's power over me. Sometimes my liberty gives me power to do something. And it's a really important question that warrants a much longer conversation. But I think it's part of what you're hinting at, right? Those are important footnotes, if nothing else, Bob.
I think it seems like there's a challenge or an imbalance, or it's a challenge to balance power versus individual liberty. If you look at some notions that the bigger the government, the smaller the individual. If we look at centralized governments like the Soviet Union, for example, bigger, more centralized the government becomes, the fewer personal liberties are involved. And so I think that this part of the challenge of the construct of the way the country was founded.
And I want to make sure that, because I want to make sure that I put enough of a bracket on this before we're done today, but like you were.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I always think about when I think about Madison and arguments for democracy versus representative government is if we decided that we wanted everyone to have a say, record,
Common vote.
then we would just use the internet. Just let level up what the right thing to do is. Well, yes, I think we are moving in that direction, but we don't always get a really well thought out idea. It's usually very emotional based. It's not really factual based often. And I think the idea here, for better or worse, was if we give it to these smarter people, these aristocrats or whoever, learned people, that they'll give more thought to how things should move forward. Now, that didn't necessarily work out the way they wanted it, but I think the opposite wasn't going to work out very well either. If everybody feels something, let's do that. It may be in concert with the law, not in concert with it, really doesn't matter much. We all feel this way. Well, let's vote for that.
But I think that's when they get to it, when they talk about the common good. It's the common good, it's not equal to what the majority thinks.
That's correct.
And that's where you need, where, according to them, you need this interim group who we've elected, who have the intelligence, the background to determine what the common good is, which may or may not match majority opinion.
Well, more fact-based doesn't mean it's the right answer, but it's going to give them gaps of knowledge, make that choice rather than all emotional.
Feelings are not always facts.
Exactly.
But I thank you. I mean, I think that I want to make sure that let's not go away from this, interpreting this to be a rude, aristocratic text. I do not think he's explicitly saying we need to go find the smartest people and make them our politicians. I think that it's slightly different, but that what he's saying, and that might be the outcome, and maybe he likes that, probably does, is that if we put these rules in place and we have figured out the appropriate scale, if we have too many representatives, it reproduces the problem of democracy. If we have too few representatives, then it nullifies some of the effect of the voice. So we find the right balance there. What will happen is that whatever counts to their electorates as wise and good and helpful will likely get voted in. So there's a way to understand this text as James Madison saying, I've identified my friends over there, and I'm pretty sure if I write these rules, they're the ones who are going to get elected. Right? That is probably not entirely untrue, but I think that's only part of it. He's also saying this is a big, diverse country. And we have this country because we care about the free speech and free opinion that is the substance of that difference and diversity and breadth. And that these people all disagree in key ways about what that public good is, that common good is. And that if we write these rules, these people have a better chance of their value systems and their commitments and what's important to them making its way to the top. Because it's not just a matter of a false binary between big government and small government. He's rejecting that. I think this is fundamentally a pragmatic test. He's not saying big government, small government. He's saying if we have a strong central government that's transparent, coherent, and sustainable, then we're going to end up with less governmental involvement on a day-to-day basis. And that if, in fact, we do the other thing, And we have the theoretic politicians who have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to perfect equality in their political rights, if we let that be in charge, that's the biggest possible government of all, because their local government is going to figure out a way to have power and take over them in faction and be swayed by majorities. So he's rejecting the binary of big government, small government. He's saying if we're delicate about it, an abstract, powerful, faraway government is going to leave space for the actual liberty that we fought for. Now, there's profound naivete here. I mean, it's on page 55, where in the next place is each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than the small republic. So, if you guys listen to me, right, I'll paraphrase. It'll be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. So that's what I was saying before, right? Like, if you have too many representatives that are too close to the community, they're cheaper and easier to buy. This is where he's effectively saying that. And the suffrages of the people being more free, meaning big government, we make sure that we have that free participation, will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. So, I mean, I think it's great writing, but also, I mean, I think that's the crux of it. It is sort of the naivete of like, it's pessimistic and naive at the same time in its understanding of how these things are going to work out. You know, and then, you know, at the very end, the second to last full paragraph in the last page, the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within particular states, but will be unable to spread general conflagration through the other states. A lot of times you've heard things about states as the laboratories of democracy, or states are experiments in democracy. This is very akin to that. This is saying, if one state has one governor gets a bug up its ass, right? We are all here able to at least protect their citizenry with some basis of stability. We still have a Supreme Court. We still have a backdrop. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. So this is just him, you know, in some sense, ad nauseam, going back to the more that we incorporate, the more we can balance out.
Well, the only problem with that is they had no idea back then of the kind of forms of communication we have today. So, in fact, the influence of factious leaders does inflame all states and all people because it's on social media, it's in the newspapers that we don't get them noticed anymore. So, it's TikTok, okay. So that's part of the problem we have today is there is no controlling the fact versus fiction that is going on in all of these different news organizations that have formed and all these different social media influencers. And
yeah, I share that sense, and there are really interesting conversations to be had about what they did or didn't anticipate, and ways in which maybe they're right and something else is going on. I think that the last thing that I think that I should mention today, and we'll pick up on this, I think it's a segue for next time. Not only is this a fundamentally pragmatic argument, it's fundamentally an institutional argument. It makes a couple of assumptions about what people are like and how society works. And then it talks about how we're writing the rules and how the rules will make sure that things work out. This is not a thing, this is not talking about citizenship. Individual rights are silent. This has nothing to, this is why the first 10 amendments are there as the Bill of Rights, because to get this passed, they said, all right, if you want to write stuff down on what people can do, that's fine. We're pretty sure if you just write the right rules, none of that matters. So it's a different matter to say that this is bad on individual rights than it is to say that it is silent on individual rights. And I think that's sort of a key dyad where I want to go. next Tuesday, but I feel like I'm gonna
I'm gonna close with one thing.
to be so.
Hamilton really did anticipate the establishment of a board of the federal government.
I'm sorry, the fourth,
Yeah,
which is
the judiciary, the second,
the judiciary is the majority.
the fourth, what's it?
That's
Oh, that's federal bureaucracy.
Or any bureaucracy.
Anyone.
So, needless to say, I'm accustomed to talking about these things at much greater length and in much greater depth. So I know that I want to be respectful of all your time today.
Fabulous
So,
stuff.
so we'll talk next time, sort of as a more bottom up, what this means for us, where this fits. Picking up on what it means to talk about individual rights versus be silent about them. And to talk about the other thing that we talked about a little bit today, like what do we mean by politics, right? Is it engaging with our neighbors? Is it voting? Is it being civically engaged? Stuff like that.
I'm probably the only one in this room that, of course, take in mind, I was educated in California. I never got the civics class.
Yeah, no.
I never did either.
Who here
But
has
I was
civics
raised in
class?
California.
New Jersey for a very long time.
I had it in public school, but didn't have it. in
Public
private
school didn't have it. It was,
So private doesn't
I
necessarily.
was teaching for a while when they were starting to turn back to civics. It's almost like we don't want anyone to know about civics, which is terrible. And it was really a problem. I think it's being turned around.
Okay.
Thank you, Claudia.
Let's see here. Thank you, Bill. Glad you guys were here. Oh,